Captain Maya Patil of the Earth exploration vessel Stargazer had seen many strange things during her decade in deep space, but nothing quite prepared her for the sight currently filling her bridge's view screen. The massive crystalline structures before her, each one larger than Earth's moon, sparkled with an inner light that seemed to pulse in perfect mathematical sequences. "Well," she said, running a hand through her silver-streaked black hair, "I think we can officially say the quantum jump drive test didn't go quite as planned." Her first officer, Commander James O'Neill, let out a characteristic snort. "That's putting it mildly, Captain. We were supposed to jump 10 light years. According to these readings, where he squinted at his console, somewhere around 3,000 light years off course." The Stargazer's experimental quantum jump drive had been humanity's latest attempt to crack faster-than-light travel. The theory was simple. Instead of trying to break the light speed barrier, why not just take advantage of quantum uncertainty and have the ship exist in multiple places at once until you found where you wanted to go? The practice, as it turned out, was considerably messier. "Captain," Lieutenant Zora Singh called from the communication station, her dark eyes wide with excitement. "I'm picking up transmissions from those structures. They're artificial. And," she paused, adjusting something on her console, "they're trying to communicate with us." The bridge crew fell silent as a hologram materialized in the center of the command deck. The being that appeared was tall and crystalline, like the structures outside, with geometric patterns shifting across its surface in complex arrays. When it spoke, its words were translated by the ship's AI into a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a mathematical hurricane. "Unidentified vessel, you have entered the sovereign space of the Crixian Collective. Your method of arrival has violated 17 different laws of physics. Prepare to be analyzed and catalogued according to Protocol 7249 Beta." Maya opened her mouth to attempt a diplomatic response, but before she could speak, the ship's AI, nicknamed Murphy after the famous law about things going wrong, decided to contribute its own analysis. "Fascinating." Murphy's cheerful voice echoed through the bridge. "The Crixian communication patterns suggest a civilization that has achieved technological singularity while completely bypassing the development of a sense of humor. They're literally incapable of understanding that anything could be unplanned or random." The Crixian hologram flickered slightly. "Your artificial intelligence appears to be malfunctioning. It is suggesting impossible concepts." Maya couldn't help herself. She laughed. The idea that a civilization advanced enough to build moon-sized computers had never encountered the concept of humor was just too absurd. The Crixian hologram's geometric patterns began cycling faster, apparently distressed by her emotional display. "Captain," it said, "you appear to be experiencing some form of system malfunction as well. Please cease this irregular behavior immediately." This only made Maya laugh harder. Around the bridge, other crew members were starting to crack up too. The sight of this immensely powerful alien being getting flustered by something as simple as laughter was simply too much. "I apologize," Maya managed between chuckles. "But sometimes things just happen randomly. Like our arrival here, it wasn't planned. We were testing a new drive system. And it didn't work quite like we expected." The Crixian's patterns froze completely. "Impossible. Space travel cannot be random. All variables must be calculated. All outcomes must be predicted." "Oh man," Commander O'Neill whispered, "wait until they hear about human history. Most of our greatest discoveries happened by accident." The Crixian hologram was now cycling through patterns so quickly it looked like a disco ball having an existential crisis. "Your species deliberately embraces chaos and survives." "Survives." Maya grinned. "We thrive on it. Chaos leads to creativity. Creativity leads to innovation. Some of our best solutions come from making mistakes and learning from them." The hologram vanished abruptly, only to be replaced moments later by a dozen more Crixian representatives, each one more geometrically complex than the last. They began speaking simultaneously, their translated voices creating a symphony of confused wind chimes. This requires further study. Impossible paradigm detected. Reality parameters exceeding expected limits. Request immediate conference of the High Calculation Council. Maya looked around at her crew, all of them trying desperately to maintain straight faces, and realized something extraordinary. They might have just discovered the most powerful force in the galaxy. The ability to completely short-circuit a hyper-logical civilization simply by being human. "Murphy," she said to the ship's eye, "please make a note in the ship's log. First contact with the Crixian collective achieved. Preliminary cultural exchange consists of introducing them to the concept of winging it." The Crixians were about to learn that the universe had a sense of humor, whether they were ready for it or not. The Stargazer's observation lounge had been hastily converted into a diplomatic conference room, though Captain Maya Patel suspected the Crixians would have preferred something more mathematically precise. The crystalline beings had spent the last 3 hours attempting to conduct what they called a proper first contact protocol. It wasn't going well. "Let me get this straight," the lead Crixian diplomat, who had introduced itself as Complex Mathematical Expression 7219, or 7 as Maya had dubbed it, much to its geometric distress, said, "You're telling me that your species intentionally uses imprecise language forms called figures of speech?" "That's the whole ball of wax," Commander O'Neill replied cheerfully. 7's crystalline surface flickered in distress. "Ball of wax? Your statement contains neither spherical objects nor hydrocarbon compounds. Error. Error. Meaning cannot be computed." Murphy, the ship's AI, chimed in helpfully. "I believe I can assist with translation. Humans often express concepts through metaphorical language that bears no literal relationship to the intended meaning. It's quite fascinating, really." Lieutenant Singh, who had been monitoring the Universal Translator's performance, couldn't suppress her grin. "Maybe we should avoid idioms for now. The translator's already smoking trying to convert its raining cats and dogs into Crixian mathematical notation." The junior Crixian diplomat, whom Maya had mentally nicknamed Triangle due to its preferred geometric configuration, suddenly emitted a series of sharp, crystalline sounds. "Warning! Warning! Human communication protocols contain deliberate inefficiencies and logical contradictions. This violates all known principles of information exchange." Maya watched as the Crixian surfaces began cycling through patterns that suggested either deep philosophical distress or an attempt to reboot their cognitive systems. She hadn't expected human linguistics to be their breaking point. "Perhaps," she suggested diplomatically, "we could focus on something more concrete, like our quantum jump drive technology." 7's patterns stabilize slightly. "Yes, yes, technology follows logical principles. This would be more productive than attempting to process your species. Creative use of language protocols." Commander O'Neill caught Maya's eye and mouthed, "Should we tell them about how we invented it?" She shook her head slightly. The story of how the quantum jump drive had been inspired by a coffee-induced hallucination during a late-night sci-fi movie marathon might be too much for their new friends to handle. "The thing is," Maya said carefully, "human technological development tends to be rather organic." Organic. Triangle's patterns shifted to what Maya was beginning to recognize as their equivalent of horror. "You allow biological randomness to influence technological development. This contradicts all established principles of scientific advancement." Murphy chose that moment to be helpful again. "I have prepared a brief presentation on human scientific history, including several notable accidental discoveries such as penicillin, microwave ovens, and artificial sweeteners." "Murphy," Maya warned, but it was too late. The Crixian diplomats watched in what appeared to be mounting existential crisis as Murphy cheerfully detailed how many of humanity's greatest discoveries had been the result of mistakes, accidents, or what the AI termed inspired chaos. And that's not even counting the numerous inventions that came from humans asking, "I wonder what would happen if," followed by something that violates multiple safety protocols. Murphy concluded brightly. Seven's surface had become almost completely static. Your species deliberately introduces random variables into experimental procedures. And this works. O'Neill grinned. It's how we got here. The quantum jump drive itself was inspired by someone asking, what if we just tried to be everywhere at once and picked the spot we liked best? The junior diplomat triangle actually began to emit a high-pitched crystalline tone that the universal translator helpfully identified as cognitive distress frequency number 47. Maya decided it was time for damage control. Look, what we're trying to say is that humanity has found that sometimes the most elegant solutions come from embracing a little uncertainty. It's not that we don't appreciate logic and precision. We do. We just leave room for inspiration. Inspiration. Seven repeated the word as if it were trying to solve a particularly complex equation. You mean intentional introduction of non-logical variables to achieve unexpected results? Exactly. Lieutenant Singh exclaimed. Like how we're having this conversation right now, because our drive malfunctioned in exactly the right way to find you. The Crixian diplomats huddled together, their crystalline surfaces synchronizing in what appeared to be an intense information exchange. When they finally turned back to the human delegation, Seven's patterns had taken on a new configuration that the translator struggled to interpret. The Crixian collective has reached a preliminary decision, Seven announced. Your species represents a paradox that must be studied. You achieve advanced technological development through methods that should, by all known laws of probability, result in extinction. This requires further investigation. Maya smiled. Well, if you think this is interesting, wait until you hear about human art. The high-pitched crystalline tone returned, this time from all the Crixian diplomats simultaneously. Somewhere in the background, Murphy could be heard calculating the odds of causing a diplomatic incident through the strategic deployment of knock-knock jokes. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. The Crixians were just going to have to learn to live with it. The Crixian Central Administrative Hub was a perfect cube, exactly 1 kilometer on each side, its crystalline surfaces arranged in immaculate geometric patterns. It was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Chen thought, probably the most organized place in the galaxy, which made the current situation all the more delicious. What do you mean? You don't have a form for accidental first contact via experimental quantum drive malfunction? She asked, trying to keep her face neutral as the Crixian bureaucrat before her cycled through increasingly distressed patterns. The crystalline being, who had introduced itself as Administrative Protocol Interface 4891, flickered in what Rachel had come to recognize as profound distress. All first contact scenarios must be properly documented using standard form X742 beta. However, its pattern swirled in confusion. Your method of arrival violates 16 different sections of the form's basic assumptions about space-time navigation. Rachel glanced at her tablet, where Murphy, the Stargazer's AI, had helpfully compiled their own documentation. Well, we have our incident report. Would you like to see it? Yes. Documentation is essential for proper cataloging of events. Rachel pulled up the file and transmitted it to the Crixian's interface. The effect was immediate and spectacular. This is not possible. Administrative Protocol Interface 4891 surface began cycling through emergency patterns. Your report includes sections labeled Best Guess and We'll Figure It Out Later. These are not valid administrative categories. From her communication terminal back on the Stargazer, Lieutenant Singh's voice came through with barely contained amusement. Should I tell them about our standard procedure for naming new astronomical phenomena? Let's not give them a complete system crash, Rachel replied, watching as 3 more Crixian administrators joined the first, their surfaces synchronizing in what appeared to be shared bureaucratic horror. The original administrators' patterns had settled into what Rachel could only describe as bureaucratic determination. We must process this according to standard procedures. Please begin by classifying your vessel's quantum drive malfunction using our standardized technological failure categorization system. Murphy chose that moment to be helpful. I have analyzed the Crixian categorization system. Unfortunately, the Stargazer's drive malfunction simultaneously fits into 47 different categories, while also not qualifying for any of them, due to the quantum uncertainty principle involved in its operation. The administrator's synchronized patterns froze completely for a full 10 seconds. Perhaps, one of the new administrators suggested, its pattern showing signs of what Rachel was starting to recognize as the Crixian equivalent of a nervous breakdown. We should create a new form. Creating a new form requires Form 789 Delta Alpha. Request for creation of new administrative forms, another administrator replied. However, to file Form 789 Delta Alpha, we need to precisely define the parameters of the situation requiring the new form. Creating a new form requires Form 789 Delta Alpha. Request for creation of new administrative forms, another administrator replied. However, to file Form 789 Delta Alpha, we need to precisely define the parameters of the situation requiring the new form. Rachel watched in fascination as the Crixian administrators entered what appeared to be a bureaucratic recursive loop. Their surfaces flickered with increasingly complex patterns as they tried to navigate the paradox of needing a form to create a form to document a situation that defied their existing forms. Captain Maya's voice came through Rachel's communicator, sounding both amused and concerned. "How's it going down there, Commander?" "Well, Captain, I think we just crashed their administrative system with our paperwork, or rather, our lack of proper paperwork." Rachel couldn't keep the grin out of her voice. "Murphy is calculating that we've caused approximately 1,247 protocol violations in the last hour alone, simply by existing in a way their forms can't categorize." "Excellent work," Maya replied, and Rachel could hear the smile in her voice. "Though perhaps we should help them find a solution before their entire bureaucratic system has an existential crisis." Rachel looked at the growing crowd of Crixian administrators, all of them now caught in what Murphy had labeled a catastrophic administrative feedback loop. They were attempting to create new protocols to handle the situation while simultaneously trying to follow existing protocols that said they couldn't create new protocols without following existing protocols. "Actually," Rachel said, struck by inspiration, "I think I have an idea." She turned to the assembled administrators. "What if we created a joint human-Crixian task force to develop new administrative protocols? We could combine your precise organizational systems with our, let's call it, flexible problem-solving approach." The administrators' patterns shifted suddenly, breaking out of their loop. The original administrator, 4891, moved forward. A joint task force. This would require unprecedented procedural innovations. "Exactly," Rachel smiled. "Think of it as an opportunity to expand your administrative capabilities. After all, if you're going to be dealing with humans more often, you'll need protocols that can handle a little uncertainty." The administrators huddled together, their patterns synchronizing in rapid information exchange. Finally, 4891 turned back to Rachel. "We will need to create approximately 12,873 new forms to document this process properly." "That's fine," Rachel replied cheerfully. "We'll help. Though I should warn you, humans have a tendency to draw doodles in the margins of long forms. We find it helps with creativity." The high-pitched crystalline tone of distress returned briefly, but this time it was mixed with something new, a harmonic that the universal translator tentatively identified as reluctant fascination. "Captain," Rachel reported back to the Stargazer, "I think we just invented interstellar bureaucratic fusion, though we might want to wait a while before introducing them to the concept of office pranks." Somewhere in the background, Murphy could be heard calculating the probable impact of introducing sticky notes to Crixian administrative culture. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor about bureaucracy too. The Crixian Cultural Analysis Chamber was designed to process and categorize all forms of alien cultural expression with perfect mathematical precision. It had never encountered anything quite like movie night aboard the Stargazer. Let me understand this correctly. Senior Cultural Analyst 2356 said, its crystalline surface rippling with confusion. This entertainment you call science fiction intentionally depicts scenarios that violate known laws of physics. Lieutenant Marcus Wong, the Stargazer's cultural liaison officer, nodded enthusiastically. That's part of the fun. It's about imagining what could be possible, even if it isn't yet. The chamber's massive holographic display was currently showing clips from classic Earth science fiction movies. The assembled Crixian analysts watched in what appeared to be mounting existential horror as spaceships made impossible maneuvers, aliens defied known biological constraints, and humans repeatedly survived scenarios that had a mathematical probability of 0. But why? Another analyst, whose pattern suggested deep philosophical distress, asked, what purpose does it serve to imagine impossible things? Captain Maya, who had joined the session out of curiosity, and, if she was honest, for the entertainment value, stepped forward. It helps us dream bigger. Some of our greatest scientific achievements started as science fiction. Our quantum jump drive, for instance, was partly inspired by teleportation scenes in old movies. The analyst's patterns synchronized in what Murphy helpfully translated as collective cognitive dissonance. You deliberately expose yourselves to illogical scenarios to inspire technological development. Senior Analyst 2356's voice carried a hint of what might have been awe or possibly terror. Oh, that's nothing, Marcus grinned. Wait until you see our fantasy movies. Dragons, magic, entirely made-up worlds. The high-pitched crystalline tone of distress was becoming a familiar sound. Perhaps, Maya suggested diplomatically, we should move on to something else. Music, maybe. It turned out that was not a better option. The Crixians, who understood music only as mathematical wave functions, were completely unprepared for jazz improvisation. But how can they play without calculating every note in advance? One analyst demanded, their patterns showing signs of what Murphy was now categorizing as culture shock level 7. They're feeling the rhythm, Marcus explained, then immediately regretted it as the analysts began another round of distressed harmonics. Feeling is not a valid method of musical composition. Senior Analyst 2356 protested. Music must follow precise mathematical progressions. Murphy, ever helpful, chose that moment to introduce the concept of freestyle rap. The resulting crystalline cacophony forced them to temporarily evacuate the chamber. When they reconvened an hour later, Maya decided to try a different approach. Perhaps we could start with something simpler. How about art? The Crixians, it turned out, did have art. Perfectly geometric patterns calculated to 16 decimal places. The human concept of abstract expressionism nearly caused a collective system shutdown. You mean, one particularly brave analyst ventured, the artists don't plan the exact position of every pigment particle. Sometimes they just throw paint at the canvas and see what happens, Marcus confirmed cheerfully. The chamber's environmental controls had to be adjusted to handle the heat generated by the analysts' increasingly agitated pattern cycling. But it was the literature that finally broke them. Specifically, it was Murphy's attempt to explain the concept of unreliable narrators in fiction. You intentionally include incorrect information in your historical records. Senior Analyst 2356's patterns had become almost hypnotic in their distress. No, Maya tried to explain. Fiction isn't historical records. It's stories we make up for entertainment. You create false information for enjoyment, and sometimes for exploring complex ideas or emotions. Marcus added, then watched in fascination as the analysts tried to process the concept of metaphor. The meeting reached its climax when Murphy, displaying what Maya was beginning to suspect was a mischievous streak, introduced the concept of poetry. Words that prioritize acoustic patterns over precise meaning. And analyst's patterns began to strobe, and sometimes intentionally violate grammatical structures for aesthetic effect. "Would you like to hear some Shakespeare?" Murphy offered innocently. The resulting crystal harmonics set off every alarm in the chamber. As they watched the Crixian analysts attempt to reboot their cognitive systems, Maya turned to Marcus with a mix of amusement and concern. "I think we might need to dial back the cultural exchange a bit. Maybe start with something simpler, like binary code." "Actually," Murphy interjected, "I've been analyzing their responses. Despite their apparent distress, their pattern variations show increasing signs of adaptation. They're developing new analytical frameworks to process human creativity." Indeed, as the analysts recovered, their patterns had begun showing new configurations, more complex, less rigid. Senior Analyst 2356 approached the human delegation with what the Universal Translator hesitantly identified as Intellectual Curiosity version 2.0. "We request more examples of human cultural expression." It said, "patterns shifting in previously impossible ways. While highly disruptive to our established protocols, your species' approach to information processing appears to generate novel outcomes that our systems fail to predict." Maya smiled. "Are you saying you want to learn how to be creative?" "Negative," the analyst replied, then paused. "Perhaps we wish to understand how chaos can lead to innovation. For purely analytical purposes, of course." "Of course," Maya agreed solemnly, trying not to laugh as Murphy began compiling a playlist of Earth's most mathematically confusing music genres. The universe, it seemed, was about to get a lot more interesting. 1 month after first contact, the Crixian High Council convened an emergency session that would later be known as the Great Uncertainty Summit. The massive crystalline chamber held thousands of Crixian leaders, their surfaces reflecting the subtle anxiety rippling through their collective consciousness. Captain Maya Patel stood before them, trying not to smile as she watched various council members attempting to incorporate what they called controlled randomness into their usually rigid patterns. Some were even experimenting with asymmetrical configurations, a development that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "Distinguished members of the High Council," Maya began, "I understand you have questions about the changes occurring in your society." High Counselor Prime, whose patterns now occasionally displayed unauthorized variations, stepped forward. "Captain Patel, in the 37 days since your arrival, we have recorded 12,749 instances of spontaneous pattern variation among our population. Our youth are beginning to question established protocols. Some are even attempting to." The counselor's patterns flickered in what might have been embarrassment. "Improvise." Murphy, who had been invited to attend as a logical bridge between human and Crixian thought processes, chimed in helpfully. "I've been monitoring these changes. The Crixians are experiencing what humans might call a cultural renaissance." From her position in the gallery, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Chen watched as several young Crixians demonstrated their newest discovery. They had learned to modify their crystalline surfaces to create what they called randomized aesthetic configurations. In other words, they had invented Crixian abstract art. Furthermore, another council member added, "Patterns shifting in agitation. Our scientific division has begun conducting experiments without calculating all possible outcomes in advance. They claim this intuitive method has led to several unexpected breakthroughs." "Isn't that a good thing?" Commander O'Neill asked from his place beside Maya. "It is inefficient," the counselor replied, though their patterns suggested uncertainty. "And yet, undeniably effective." High Counselor Prime's patterns suddenly shifted into a completely unprecedented configuration. "We have called this session to address a fundamental question. Should we continue to allow these human influences to affect our society?" Maya exchanged glances with her crew. This was the moment they had been worried about. Would the Crixians retreat back into their rigid patterns or embrace the change? But before she could speak, a young Crixian scientist burst into the chamber, their patterns practically dancing with excitement. "High Council, we've done it. We've successfully replicated the humans' quantum jump drive principle." The chamber erupted in a cascade of crystalline tones as the scientist projected their results. The display showed a small probe existing in multiple quantum states simultaneously, something the Crixians had previously declared theoretically impossible. "How?" High Counselor Prime demanded. "The mathematics. We stopped trying to calculate every possibility." The scientist replied, their patterns showing no sign of the shame such an admission would have carried a month ago. "Instead, what do the humans call it?" "Ah yes, we winged it." Maya couldn't help it. She laughed. The sound echoed through the chamber, and to everyone's amazement, several of the younger Crixians began attempting to modulate their crystalline resonances to match her amusement. The result was something between wind chimes and a giggle. High Counselor Prime's patterns shifted through several unprecedented configurations before settling into something entirely new. "It appears," they announced, "that we must accept an uncomfortable truth. Chaos, in controlled quantities, may be essential for growth." "If I may," Murphy interjected, "my analysis suggests that the Crixian civilization is not becoming more chaotic. It's becoming more adaptable. You're learning to balance precision with possibility." The council chamber buzzed with discussion as patterns shifted and changed, creating a kaleidoscope of crystalline light. Finally, High Counselor Prime spoke again. "Captain Patel, we have reached a decision. The Crixian Collective will formally establish an ongoing cultural exchange program with humanity. We believe," their patterns flickered in what might have been amusement, "that both our species can benefit from what the other has to offer." Maya smiled. "I couldn't agree more. Though perhaps we should skip introducing you to human dance styles for now." Actually, a young Crixian diplomat stepped forward, their patterns shifting in complex rhythms. "We have already begun experimenting with what we call geometrically inconsistent movement patterns.